Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. You know, London housing is so expensive. Not even Klingons can afford to buy here, Stacy.
Max, not the Klingons from Star Trek. These are called middle-class Klingons. The headline reads, middle-class Klingons squeezed out of London property market. So the Financial Times looked at all the recent data from Savills housing market, and what they found was that the FT findings show how the purchasing power of a wealthy uber middle is increasingly pushing the most desirable neighborhoods out of the reach of middle-class Klingons, whose salaries have failed to keep pace over the past 40 years.
Well, the government's going to have to put them all into the transporter room and beam them onto another planet where you don't need a job to work, you don't need food, you don't need water, you don't need air. You just got to get out of there because the policies have created this enormous gulf, this enormous split. So these Klingons, which I assume was like, hello, 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 they're trying to cling onto having some modicum of middle-class existence, are being beamed out of the place, gone.
Well, the Klingons are what I guess you would call the lower middle class, and they're the sort of people who could afford to live in, say, Camden Town, which is not too far from central London. But now those very people who only 20 years ago could have afforded to buy there based on their average salary at the time, now that average salary today would only get you to like a further out on the commuter lines in places like Redbridge.
Well, I mean, it's not really a middle class at all. It's just being split right down the middle. So you've got the tops at the upper end, and then you've got the everyone else, the losers, are being forced out of this immediate London area code where all of the easy money being printed by the central bank is available for terms undisclosed and non-transparent.
Yeah, and of course, it proves once again that working for a living is a chump's game. Because if you have to work for a salary, you have nowhere to live. And you might have a commute that's 2 or 3 hours long to get into that job that can afford to pay for the house that you have way out in Redbridge.
Yeah, I miss the British working class. You know, these guys that come in, they eat their beans on toast, and their, you know, tea, little tea for a £1 or 2 pounds, and then they go get a jackhammer, and then, blah, 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 blah. You know, working people. I miss them. You don't see them much anymore in London. You see tourists, you see toffs, you see dandies. You don't really see working people anymore. You don't need working people anymore. You don't need cops. You don't need firemen. You don't need any kind of workers. You don't need their paycheck. You don't need their taxes because you can just print down at the Bank of England. You don't need them. They're unneeded.
And in fact, the Klingons, you know, in America, it would have been called the lower middle class, and most people are thinking that's somebody who works at Walmart or maybe an auto mechanic or something. But this is like anybody below the top 10% can't afford to live in London. So they say that by 2012, an average home in whole sections of London, including the City of London, Kensington and Westminster, had become completely unaffordable to families earning £45,000 a year net, putting them among the top 10% of all earners in the UK. The situation has become markedly more difficult for Klingons since then, with prices continuing to recover from the 2009 slump.
Right, I mean, recover meaning pumped up with all the money that was taken from the workers and savers and given to the speculators and the profiteers. And so what you end up with London as Disney World, which is a very high-priced tourist destination. The West End is booming. People from around the world are coming in, and they're splashing out a lot of money, but it's not a place other than an amusement park.
But the other thing is, you know, we know somebody who is involved in property speculation, and he said that his friend, who's a Chinese billionaire, what he is doing, buying up properties, including here, is that he reckons that as long as they get 50% back, they don't care. It's better than going down to the local money laundering mat, and you might get only 10 cents back on the dollar that you're, you know, taking out of your own home country.
Right, if you're a corrupt Chinese businessman and you're trying to fence $1 billion that you stole from the people of China, you can come to London and you get 50p on the dollar, on the pound, to fence that money. It's better than going to some other operation and maybe only getting 10 or 15% on the money you've purloined from your government, from your country.
Well, actually, they're making money. They're being paid by the fence here. Right now, that hasn't gone down, but they're willing to take 50, 60% loss.
Right.
Now, the other thing is, you know, speaking of bad neighbors or people who can't afford certain areas or people who can, Well, across America, you know that whole regions of America have been decimated by fracking. And this is something that's going to be brought here, by the way. And here's a headline: Exxon CEO joins lawsuit against fracking project because it will devalue his $5 million property. As ExxonMobil CEO, it's Rex Tillerson's job to promote the hydraulic fracturing enabling the recent oil and gas boom and fight regulatory oversight. The oil company is the biggest natural gas producer in the United States, relying on the controversial drilling technology to extract it. The exception is when Tillerson's $5 million property value might be harmed. Tillerson has joined a lawsuit that cites fracking's consequences in order to block the construction of a 160-foot water tower next to his wife's Texas home. Now, these water towers, of course, this process of fracking requires a huge amount of water and giant lorries, giant trucks going in and out, back and forth between the water tower and the fracking location, stirring up a lot of dust, a lot of traffic, a lot of potholes in the road.
The economics of fracking are horrible because the cost far exceeds the benefit to GDP from burning the gas that you are fracked. So your debt in the UK will go up as a result of all this fracking. That's just on the economic side. Plus, it takes more energy to frack than you get out to burn. So strictly on the British thermal unit, the BTU equation, it's net negative. It's like ethanol. The United States is also a net negative. You don't hear much about ethanol anymore because it came and went in a flash, because it was a joke. It was just a way to churn a bunch of derivatives and energy futures contracts to make a few people rich on the commission. Similar with fracking, you've got the Big Six cartel here in the UK. They'll make a quick payday. They'll leave the mess for the government to pay. The citizens will have to have their taxes raised. They'll end up with a lot more debt, and they won't be any warmer, and the price of energy will go higher. It's a net loser. That's just on the economic side. On the ecological side, yes, it causes cancer. Okay, that's all you need to know.
So here is a guy, he's a CEO of one of the largest corporations in the world, the biggest natural gas producer in America, one of the biggest oil producers in the world, of the corporations, not the nations. And he is in a obviously very wealthy area, whatever city it is a $5 million home. The poorest region of Texas, however, is the one undergoing the most fracking, the most new fracking wells suddenly since 2008. And it is known as the Eagle Ford shale play. This 400-mile-long, 50-mile-wide bacchanal of oil and gas extraction stretches from the Leon County, Texas in the northeast to the Mexico border in the southwest. Since 2008, more than 7,000 oil and gas wells have been sunk into the brittle sedimentary rock. Another 5,500 have been approved by state regulators, making the Eagle Ford one of the most active drilling sites in America. Now, that paragraph goes with this headline, Max: fracking boom leaves Texans under a toxic cloud. This is a poor area of Texas. They're under a toxic cloud. A lot of these drilling sites, 5,500, they don't even have to report to any environmental agency how much toxins they're spewing into the air. And the article follows one woman who has asthma, and she can no longer even go outside. She could barely drive anywhere. That 400-mile wide region, by the way, that is the same distance. I took a little Google map here from London to Edinburgh. Exactly. So that's the size of this area. That's the size of the area. If you look at the fracking map of the UK, what the planned fracking map is, you see it's about the same size.
Britain took on the Help to Buy scheme for real estate, which is a copycat of the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac debacle, which caused the subprime crisis in 2007. The British energy corporations are going to take fracking on, even though in America it's been proven to be completely uneconomical, an environmental disaster. But they're going to do it here anyway. Because why? Nobody in the media here, except for maybe George Mobiat over there at The Guardian, will say anything about the fact that this is an ecological disaster and, more importantly, an economic boondoggle that will increase Britain's debt to even higher than it is right now, the highest it's been in decades.
Well, you talk about the health problems. Now, this woman that they cover here, Lynn Buring, she has severe asthma, as I said, but as the article points out, people who live close to oil and gas development, whether in Texas's Eagle Ford, Pennsylvania's Marcellus Shale, or Wyoming's Green River Basin, tend to report the same symptoms: nausea, nosebleeds, headaches, body rashes, and respiratory problems. Public health experts say these shared experiences point to a pressing need for improved air monitoring. Quote, "If you have pockets of communities with the same symptoms downwind of several sources, then there is a body of evidence," says Isabella Simpson, an atmospheric scientist at the University of California, Irvine, who studies air pollution around the world. So there's a body of evidence But because the government and the regulators, by the way, most of them come from the industry itself, and then go back to the industry itself. The regulators refuse to collect any of the evidence, don't ask the corporations to collect any of the evidence, so there is no evidence other than the evidence.
Right, well, you've got a triangle of fraud here, because the government is going to underwrite frackers coming to the United Kingdom by issuing a lot of government debt, that is to say, increase the debt. It's going to cost wave after wave after wave of health-related issues at the same time that they're privatizing the National Health Service, or the NHS. So the government is effectively taking money out of the NHS and giving it to frackers. And when it causes the health issues and the people who are complications of asthma and cancer that are related to fracking, irrefutable proof, they won't have an NHS to go to. But I suspect that the government, under Cameron or whoever else is the next leader, will give them a bond, a fracking bond, that's good for natural gas under certain circumstances, but don't apply to you in this lifetime. And that'll be their recompense for having allowed this to happen.
Well, there are going to be many more cling-ons following this, because as Lynn Buring says, her home, where she planned to retire, which was like everybody here, her retirement plan was her home. Well, she can't sell it now because it's in a wasteland, and there's very little sympathy. As the article points out, Americans don't care as long as they get their cheap gas. So the health issues faced by people who live in drilling areas, not just in Texas, but throughout the United States, simply don't carry enough weight to counterbalance the financial benefits derived from oil and gas development, said Robert Forbes, Jr., an assistant professor of political science at Texas Tech University. Energy wins practically every time, he said. It seems cynical to say, but that's how states see it. Promote economic development and minimize risk factors, which sounds exactly like what David Cameron says here to the people here. It's about economic development. We'll try to mitigate risk disasters.
Right, and he's lying. It's about economic catastrophe to give his buddies a big fat paycheck. And that's the bottom line. As the people of Somerset who have been flooded out of their homes, there's no insurance available anymore for your homes. Try to sell your homes. You get doodly squat. Why? Because the government didn't build flood barriers. They gave the money to Barclays, HSBC, Royal Bank of Scotland, and that other frickin' bank in the UK. Tough cookies. All right, we got to go. Thanks for being ever more on this Keiser Report.
Okay, Max.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more.
You don't pay bills, you don't pay house notes, you don't pay car notes. You have no responsibilities.
I've lost everyone in my life that I cared about. They're gone. When that happened, I came to Skid Row.
I was a national champion in track and field, and also was able to go and qualify for the Olympic Games. You know, in 1988, I started to experiment with other drugs. I had lost all the financial means that I had, and was really on the street.
Are you brown? You can't stand on the sidewalk. You can't sit on the crate. You can't cross the street. You can't.
Choose your language.
Good morning from me, Kevin Owen. If you're bienvenidos a nuestra edición semanal.
Choose the news that concerns you. Choose the opinions that invigorate your mind. Choose the stories that impact your life. Choose the access to your RT.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Andrew Spooner, a blogger at asiaprovocateur.blogspot.co.uk. Andrew, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Hi, Max. Nice to be here.
All right, first question. Most of the Western media is focused on Ukraine and Venezuela, not so much on Thailand, where violent protests are also happening. What's going on?
In Thailand at the moment, you've got a group that's basically the so-called Democrat Party, a bunch of former MPs. They started by protesting against an amnesty bill back in November. The amnesty bill was immediately dropped by the government, and they've sort of increased their kind of demands going on. Basically, they kind of said they wanted to end democracy at one point. The government did dissolve itself, call an election, and they tried to block the election, people voting, using weapons, grabbing people by the throat, attacking ordinary Thai voters, ordinary poor Thai voters.
Let's drill down to the dimension here. So, from an outsider's point of view, there are the red shirts and the yellow shirts. So, kind of as objectively as you can, you know, what do these two sides think they're doing?
The red shirts believe that they're bringing democracy. They're establishing democracy. They're trying to establish sort of their political rights and the political rights of everybody in Thailand. The yellow shirts have a kind of attachment to the sort of social, cultural power of the monarchy and of the old establishment, and they believe that any threat to that via democracy or via a sort of establishment of a sort of free market or an emerging sort of petty bourgeoisie is a direct threat to that. There is no sort of aspirational culture in a sense.
Now, usually what we're seeing around the world of these uprisings, you've got the first wave of, I guess you could call it moderates, who are seeking change, and then there's a wave behind that where it's radical, because the moderates, the protests go on for too long, you know, go longer than people can hold out for, things start to get nasty, and then it becomes just more of a street fighting, violent situation. At this point in time, what stage of the narrative are we at in this scenario unfolding in Thailand? Because I mean, up until recently, I've noticed that there have been periodic uprisings in Thailand, but they seem to calm down pretty quickly, as quickly as they rise up. But now we see something emerging that could be have a little bit more of a country-shaping event. Continue, please.
No. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Thailand now, I mean, the protesters have been, they were called fascists, neo-fascists, by a whole bunch of Thai academics and political scientists. They've even been likened to Mussolini's black shirts by Forbes magazine and by somebody from the Cato Institute, which is hardly a sort of bastion of sort of radical left-wing thought. So they're kind of, to see them as sort of radicals in terms of changing something, no, they want to kind of keep things as they are. They talk of reform, but when you actually look at their reforms, they don't actually have any plan of reform. It's more they want to establish the status quo. So the real people who are trying to bring about radical change on a Thailand relevance, in a sense, what's relevant to Thailand would be the red shirts or that side who say we must accept political rights. So the yellow shirts, they're getting more extreme, but they were always extreme. They were always very, very extreme. They were always violent. And we've had they've been linked to the aristocracy. They're linked to very, very wealthy families. You've had the scions of billionaire families actually appearing on stage and saying, poor people shouldn't have the right to vote.
Okay. Aristocracy versus poor people.
Yes.
Okay, now that seems like a recurring theme around the world. Now, going back a couple of years, we coined the phrase global insurrection against banker occupation, or Xiaobo. And we see wave after wave of this around the world. It started Arab Spring. We see it in Ukraine. You could characterize it in this way. Venezuela, South America. Now we're seeing it in Bangkok. So can I say that this is part of this global insurrection against banker occupation? Because you start talking about aristocracy versus the poor, then you're tapping right into the fact that a few bankers around the world in all these countries, including Thailand, have colluded to rob the people.
I mean, I would say it probably goes a bit further than just bankers. I would say that if you look at, say, one of the leading figures in the is the former finance minister of the Democrat Party, a guy called Korn, and Chatty Cavendish, and he is a JP Morgan guy, and so there he is condemning. How
does that get away from a banker? Unless I checked, JP Morgan was a bank.
Yeah, but he's in there saying that one of the big issues at the moment is an agricultural subsidy scheme called rice pledging, where the government has bought rice at a higher price and then sells it on. And it's interesting to see all these billionaires complaining about it. Although when they were...
But why is that interesting? In other words, billionaires complain all the time. You know, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs involved in outside of Detroit. They're warehousing aluminum and other metals and creating a totally distorted market in basic entities. We know that Goldman Sachs totally overthrew Greece with flooding the country with bad debt and now picking off assets for penny on the dollar. So why wouldn't this be the same in Thailand? It's just a bunch of bankers. They find Thailand is ripe to be exploited in this way. And this is what it seems like, part and parcel of this growing phenomenon. Now, let's talk about food prices for a second, because on one hand, when food prices get to a certain level, people revolt and riot, roughly 40% of disposable income. And I've heard reports, two reports. I've heard reports that food prices are on the rise, and this is contributing to unrest, but also, according to what I'm reading here, that part of the historic floods and months of unrest is keeping inflation low, and I would assume that would include food. So if you can talk, is that true or not true? Because the definition of inflation is different in different contexts. So first question is the price of food rising? The
price of food, when it was rising and inflating very high a couple of years ago, I wouldn't say it's particularly a huge issue now. I think there's certainly fears around that issue, and I think when you're poor, obviously when when you're living on sort of hand-to-mouth subsistence wages, a small increase in food prices would have a massive
right, well, this is what we've noticed around the world. But so amongst the poor, is price of food rising?
I would say that yes, it is.
Okay, so there you go. They can't feed themselves. So, I mean, the average price over the whole country might be at one level, but the people who are upset and their price of their food is going higher.
But I think there is some wealth distribution. This government that's been in power has attempted to redistribute some wealth. There's no doubt of that. And I think that part of the reason that there's been this so-called uprising now is to sort of destabilise that process and prevent a redistribution of wealth. And that's not to say that the sort of Taxonite bloc who are in power, so-called, are some kind of benevolent, wealthy billionaires. They do it for a reason, because they know it can win votes and keep them in power. But it's still being done.
So that would be Thaksin, the former prime minister, correct?
Yes, Thaksin is the deposed prime minister who was ousted in a coup, and now his sister is the prime minister. But, I mean, when Thaksin was in power in his first swathe of government, they reduced poverty in Isan, the poorest area of Thailand, dramatically. They redistributed wealth dramatically. They brought in healthcare schemes where literally poor people who were dying of easily preventable diseases before could get affordable healthcare. Now, those policies have been dismissed as populist. I would say that the government was doing its job, looking after its population, and that bloc are opposed to that, using terms like self-sufficiency economy, that somehow the poor should just wait for charitable handouts, rather than seek to kind of develop themselves or develop their economy, develop the local economy, develop the infrastructure, except the infrastructure in Thailand is appalling for a country of its wealth. It's 30, 50, 60 years old, some of it.
Let me ask you, now I don't mean to be characterizing this in any way, besmirching it in any way, but let me draw a rough comparison to the conflicts, the ongoing conflicts in Northern Ireland. And the reason I mention this is because if I go to Northern Ireland, and I've been there, and I sit down with 5 or 6 people, not a single person can tell me what these troubles are about. They don't know where they live. They don't know what counties they're in. They don't know what side they're on. It's just a Gordian knot of hate, basically, with no beginning or end. It's just a pile of nonsense. Is there any similarity to this Thailand situation? Because the opposing forces, the conflicting forces, there's a lot of overlap. Is it clear cut what the two sides are?
Is it ever clear-cut? I suppose. But I would say that, yeah, you've got pro-democracy versus anti-democracy. I mean, that would be my take, if you really wanted to simplify it down. Of course, within that, you'll get factors developing on factors.
We saw that in Egypt. There's pro-democracy.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
They go into the Tahrir Square. Yay, democracy! And now they're wiped out because they don't have the stamina, they don't have the resources, they don't have it. Now they're gone. Now it's going into a place that's I wouldn't characterize as chaotic. So, okay, here we have pro-democracy, Thailand. Now is the first wave over? Now we're into a second wave, which is like, oh my, what the frick is going on here?
I would say that I would say that democracy is not yet fully being established in Thailand. I still think that we're moving towards that point. So I don't even know that you could even characterise as there's been a democracy established and there's other parties who are attacking it. There's been 18 coups. There's been the most vile dictators.
18 coups?
Yes, in Thailand since the 1932. There's been massacre after massacre. There's been brutal dictators. In the 60s, 50s and 60s, you had a guy called Sarit Tanarat who was well known for actually executing people himself.
Okay, now...
all backed by the Americans, of course, all armed by the US, etc., etc.
Okay, so with that, they've got similarity with Latin America, Central America,
yes.
the CIA active.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Ukraine, obviously, John what's his name? John McCain is over there, stoking all kinds of fervor to support, giving no support to the democratically elected government at that time. I thought John McCain was pro-democracy, but I guess he's pro-shysterism, I think. He's John McCain, we love shysters. All right, so we got about a minute left. Let's just talk about where we are now in terms of the economy in Thailand. Where's it now? Where's it heading?
I think the economy, if there's political stability, will develop, grow, and I think that's why investors won't just move out of there because they see it as as a sure bet. But I do think that the political crisis is damaging confidence, and I suppose that's inevitable.
Right, and is it regionally, is there much of a split between the North and the South, I mean, in terms of tourism and this type of thing?
Well, I think the South is much wealthier. It's always been much wealthier in Thailand. The Northeast has always been poorer. That's why the present government has been pouring resources into there. And there's some resentment of that from the sort of Bangkok and the southern people who tend to be sort of pro-yellow shirt rather than pro-red shirt.
Okay, Andrew Spooner, we're out of time. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Andrew Spooner. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.